Here we go. This is our last review video for our STAR test on Tuesday. This one's going to cover the Civil War. So we're going to look through some of the causes, and we're going to look through what actually happened during the war. So in order to get started, we have to have a good, thorough understanding of these causes. And I'm going to go through this presentation we did in class a few weeks ago. There were three main causes for the war. We had the issue of states' rights, we had the issue of slavery, and we had this concept of sectionalism. Now here's the deal. The Civil War was caused by all three. You cannot say that the Civil War was only an issue of states' rights. You cannot say the Civil War was only an issue of slavery. And you cannot say the issue of the Civil War was only sectionalism. They all three were intertwined with each other. If you have ever seen hair being braided or rope being braided together, that's what these three causes are like in regards to the Civil War. So we have the issue of states' rights, which is basically who gets the final say in matters. Does the federal government get the final say, or do the states get the final say? And of course, the states were wanting to continue the idea of slavery, but their question was, do the states decide slavery, or does the federal government decide slavery? So we have an issue of states' rights. We have, of course, slavery being an issue, the North being a very abolitionist. We have the South needing the slaves for their farms and plantations. And then sectionalism basically just kind of describes the utter differences between the North and the South. Okay, so both slavery and states' rights are all throughout all of these triggers, if you will. We have the Missouri Compromise of 1820. We have another compromise in 1850. We have the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott v. Sanford, John Brown's Raid, and then the final one being Abraham Lincoln becoming president. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through each one of these triggers, and you'll see how they all eventually led up to the Civil War. Okay, very first one is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. We had a problem during westward expansion. As we as a country and as a people are moving west, what are we going to do with the new states we create? What are we going to do with Missouri? What are we going to do with Illinois? What are we going to do with Louisiana and Mississippi and Arkansas? Are these states going to be slave states, or are they going to be free states? Because you got to remember, they were trying to keep a balance in Congress. We're trying to keep an equal number of free states and an equal number of slave states. And the idea was, if we keep it balanced, if we keep it equal, then we're not going to have this problem explode in our faces. So they keep compromising. And the Compromise of 1820 drew a line on 3630 parallel. And it basically said any state that comes in above 3630 is going to be a free state. And then any state that comes into the Union below 3630 is going to be a slave state. And so this made people happy for the most part. It was a compromise. You have Missouri coming in as a slave state, even though it was above the line, under the condition that Maine, up here in the top northeast, come in as a free state. All right, so this works for a little while. Life moves on, and we get the Compromise of 1850. And so I'm actually going to go back to the same map for the Compromise of 1850, because what this compromise did is it took the state of California, and California is trying to come into the Union as a free state. And so the compromise was, we'll let California come into the Union as a free state, but we'll allow the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act was a law that basically said if a slave escaped from his slave owner in the South and ran away to the North, if he was caught in the North, he had to be sent back to his owner in the South. The North didn't particularly like this, but it is a compromise, which means both sides get something, and the South got this Fugitive Slave Act. And so you start getting advertisements like this in newspapers, trying to find their slaves, because if they know if they can find the slave, they have every legal right to bring it back home in the South. So that's the Missouri Compromise of 1820, drew the line at 3630. Missouri Compromise of 1850 resulted in the Fugitive Slave Act. During this time, though, we also have books being written, the most famous book being Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and basically the idea behind this book, it follows an old man named Uncle Tom. He is a slave, and it follows just his life and just the brutal life that he lives. It follows the beatings he gets. It follows just the cruel conditions that he had to suffer simply because he was a slave. And so this book starts changing people's minds. It starts getting the abolitionist movement moving forward full steam ahead. You have people reading this book who may have never thought about slavery before, but because they've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, now they realize how evil of a thing slavery actually was. And so this was a major component in the abolitionist movement gaining speed. All right, and so we're still stuck with this. What do we do with the new land? We've had the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri Compromise of 1850, and now we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act focused on was this territory here, kind of in purple, and it said we're going to use this concept of popular sovereignty and let the people decide if it's going to be a free state or a slave state. We're not going to try to look at 3630 line anymore. We're not going to make fugitive slave acts anymore. Let's just let the people decide whether it's a free state or a slave state. And so it's a good idea, but what ended up happening was you have people realizing that if there are more free-believing people in the state, it's going to be a free state. But if you have more slave-believing people living there, that's going to be a slave state. And so you start having tons of people on both sides of this issue pouring into the territory. And when you have tons of free people living there and tons of slave-believing people living there, it's inevitable to have conflict. And you start getting nicknames like Bleeding Kansas because you start having all these battles with each other. You start having people killing each other simply because they believed in slavery. Or you had people killing people simply because they believed in freeing the slaves. So Bleeding Kansas results as the Kansas-Nebraska Act gives popular sovereignty to those people. Okay, during the same time, we also have a case called the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. And this is a picture of the slave Dred Scott. And what happened is he was a slave in the South. He ended up going to the North, and then he moved again, moved back down to the South. It got a little bit complicated, but really, Dred Scott believed he had a case to prove that he was indeed now a free man. And so he went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looks at it and says, here's the deal. You are a slave. And because you are a slave, you are not considered a human being. You are considered property. And because you are considered property, you really shouldn't even be allowed to have your case brought before the Supreme Court. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to rule anyway. Slaves are property, period. And so this was a big blow to the abolitionist movement, but it also gave the South kind of an excuse, if you will, for slavery. If you're viewing slaves as a piece of property instead of a human being, then it's relatively easy to be a slave owner. Because you're not harming a human, you're harming just your property. So really a very, very bad case, very bad decision, very bad ruling. But what you need to remember, Dred Scott said that slaves are property. Okay, and then we have John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist. I believe he read Uncle Tom's Cabin. He said, here's the deal. We need to do something about this issue of slavery. And the way I'm going to deal with it is I'm going to arm the slaves. I'm going to give them weapons. I'm going to give them guns. And we're going to lead a revolution against the slave owners. So John Brown heads out west. He finds slaves, he arms them, and they start killing the white slave owners. And John Brown is arrested because he was kind of murdering people, and he was eventually hung. And when they hung him, that just furthered the cause of the abolitionists. It said, you know what, we have this man, John Brown, fighting for the slaves. He was killed. We need to keep up his fight. And so John Brown, big martyr, if you will, for the abolitionist cause. All right, and then we have Abraham Lincoln coming on the scene. And Abraham Lincoln's a very complicated figure. Today, we don't understand Abraham Lincoln correctly. But Abraham Lincoln becomes president. South Carolina says, we're gone, and they secede from the Union. Several of the other states fall immediately behind and start seceding. And we have the Civil War coming in full-blown because we have states that have pulled out of the Union. And let me go back to the other PowerPoint so that we can look at this well. Okay, so those are the causes. You have Abraham Lincoln, who said you cannot secede from the Union. And we looked at his inaugural address. We have Jefferson Davis being the president of the South, the Confederacy, saying, actually, we can secede. And we'll look at those ideas a little bit more detail here in a second. But I want to walk us through the battles to start with. We have South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union when Abraham Lincoln became president. And you have these Union soldiers at Fort Sumter. Well, Fort Sumter is in South Carolina. South Carolina said, you need to get out of here. We are a different country. We are not the U.S. We have U.S. soldiers in our country. We want you gone. And so the soldiers, they retreated into Fort Sumter, which is almost like a little bit of an island fort, if you will. And eventually they wouldn't leave and they wouldn't leave. And so the South Carolina Army fires upon Fort Sumter. They attack the fort. They win. They take the fort. And you can see here, it's a very grainy picture. But this is a picture of a Confederate flag being raised at Fort Sumter after the battle. And so Fort Sumter kicks off this thing called a war. Abraham Lincoln was trying to avoid a war, but he was willing to do so. He was willing to have a war if he needed to. Fort Sumter starts it. All right, and so a couple of battles we just need to be familiar with over the course of the 4 years. Fort Sumter was the first one. Battle of Antietam was considered the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire war. You can see that the estimated casualties were 22,717. That's almost 23,000 people killed in one day. That's insane. Take Hogg Middle School, which is sitting around, let's just say 600-700. We're looking at thousands of Hogg Middle School populations being killed in one day. That's the Battle of Antietam. It was influential because Robert E. Lee, being the commander of the South, he had his men in Maryland, but the Battle of Antietam drove Lee and his men out of Maryland. It gave Abraham Lincoln a victory. Abraham Lincoln said, you know what? We win the Battle of Antietam, although it was really kind of up in the air. We don't really know. It's kind of a draw. You could say the South won. You could say the North won. Lincoln claimed it as victory for the North, though. And because he claimed the Battle of Antietam as victory, he gave him an excuse to give out the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation basically freed the slaves in the South only. And so this is where we have to understand Abraham Lincoln correctly. Here's a quote from him that says, "I would save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union." So it's very clear that Abraham Lincoln is fighting to save the Union. He's not fighting a war over slavery. And he's simply using this freeing the slaves as a political maneuver, if you will, to help him win this war to keep the Union together. All right. And so what the North had what they called an Anaconda Plan. And so the Anaconda Plan is taking the idea of a snake. And an anaconda, the way it kills its prey, if you will, is it just kind of squeezes it to death. And so the idea that the North had was they would kind of surround the southern states, the Confederacy, if you will. They were going to surround it and basically squeeze it to death. And so that's why you have this picture here on the screen. It looks like a snake kind of surrounding around it. And you have, this is their battle plan. And so what they had to be able to do in order for this plan to work was they had to take, they wanted to take the Mississippi River right here where my mouse is, okay? If they could take the Mississippi River, that would help them come up the west side of the Confederacy and kind of strangle them to death. And so in order to take the Mississippi River, though, they had to take Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. And Vicksburg is right here in Mississippi. So I'm using my mouse. It's right up in here. All right. And so the South had to keep Vicksburg, or the North was going to go up the entire length of the Mississippi River and kind of complete the Anaconda Plan. And the South lost. The Union won. And so we start moving towards Gettysburg, which was a turning point of the war. 3-day-long battle. The North had relatively been losing up until this point. The South had been winning. However, at the Battle of Gettysburg, the North won. And with the North winning the Battle of Gettysburg, momentum kind of took over, and the North eventually wins the war. Appomattox Courthouse is where Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. This basically ends the war. A couple days later, Lincoln is assassinated, and we move into the Reconstruction period after the war. And so we have this concept of what are we going to do with all of these states who were these rebellious states. They broke away from the Union. They seceded. They became their own country, if you will. What are we going to do about the now? How are we going to bring them back into the Union? We start getting some amendments to deal with the slaves. Think back to how we actually amend the Constitution in a previous video. We have the 13th Amendment, which actually freed them. We have the 14th, which gave them citizenship. And we have the 15th that gave them the freedom to vote. And so those are the big three things that come out of Reconstruction. All right, another thing just to have in the back of your head, we have what's called scallywags and carpetbaggers. And scallywags are basically men who lived in the South who kind of worked with the Union people during Reconstruction to make money. We have carpetbaggers, which were people, businessmen in the North who moved to the South, took advantage of the South during Reconstruction just to make money. Scallywags and carpetbaggers, neither one of them were treated well because they were hated because of their selfish desire just to make money off of a war, if you will. Okay, let's go back and look at these people really quick because we need to know who they are. Abraham Lincoln, he was the president of the Union during his inaugural address, which you read. He basically said two things. He said, we have to keep the Union together. States, you can't secede. States, you can't just pull out of the Union when you want to. We said, we are going to be a Union. You have to stay. And of course, remember at the beginning of the speech, he basically said, I really don't care what happens to the slaves. Really, it just, I've already given you legal rights to have slaves. I'm not messing with that. And my issue is not with slavery. My issue is with you thinking you can leave the United States. And so that's Abraham Lincoln. You have Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, during his inaugural address, which you also read as well. Jefferson Davis gives a very strong argument for why we can secede. He basically uses the exact same argument the colonists used during the American Revolution. He says that if a government breaks its commitment to protecting my unalienable rights, I can fight you. I can break off from you. And so you read his speech. You saw the argument he gave for the United States government treating the South very poorly. All right. And so whether you agree with Abraham Lincoln, whether you agree with Jefferson Davis, that's for you to decide. But we have Ulysses S. Grant, who was the final general for the Union troops. He brought victory to the Union, and he's the one who accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, which is interesting. Ulysses S. Grant actually owned slaves, and he fought for the North. So be very careful if you make and you hear people say the North was against slavery. Not entirely. Ulysses S. Grant owned slaves, and he was the general in charge of the entire Union Army. Robert E. Lee was the general for the Southern Army. He was the general of the Confederacy. And we get this famous saying that is, well, that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it. And so that's Robert E. Lee. You have men like Stonewall Jackson, who also fought for the South. He was Lee's right-hand man. I kind of like this quote from Stonewall. It said, never take counsel in your fears, basically saying, don't let fear control you. The reason he was named Stonewall Jackson is because during battles, officers were allowed to stand in the back. And so the idea being, if the officers are standing in the back, they don't die. We need officers to run the war. So officers typically stood in the back during the fight. Stonewall Jackson, however, stood in front of his men. So he was just as likely to get killed as the private standing in front with a gun was going to get killed. His men respected him for that. All right, a couple of people you need to be aware of. We have William Carney, who was the first African-American to receive the Medal of Honor. You have Philip Bazar, who was a sailor. He was in the Navy. He earned a Medal of Honor. He was Hispanic. And we have Hiram Rhodes Revels, who was a freed slave. He was the first freed slave to become a senator in the government. All right, that does it. That covers review from the very beginning of the year until now. You guys have done an incredible job. I am proud of you, whether you pass the test or fail the test. I don't care. You've done well. You've worked hard. And I have complete confidence that you're going to completely ace this test. Don't be stressed. Don't worry. If you have any questions, let me know. You got it, and I will see you guys at school.